Before refrigeration existed, before the tin can was invented, before supply chains stretched across a continent, indigenous peoples had already solved the problem of portable, long-lasting food, and that solution was called pemmican. A dense, dark block, small enough to fit in a belt pouch and heavy enough to feel like a stone in your hand. No smell, no moisture, nothing to invite rot or ruin. It could last a year. Some accounts say 5. The Lakota called it wasna. The Cree and Blackfoot had their own names and their own variations, but across the Great Plains, the underlying answer was the same. The people who made it weren't guessing, and they weren't lucky. They had worked out, through generations of observation, failure, and refinement, one of the most calorie-dense, shelf-stable, portable foods ever made by any culture on Earth. This isn't a story about primitive survival. It's a story about engineering. About a people who looked at the most abundant resource in their environment and turned it into something that could sustain human life across hundreds of miles of hostile terrain, through winters that lasted 6 months, without any of the preservation technology we take for granted today. The Great Plains of North America stretch from the Canadian boreal forest in the north down to the Texas hill country in the south, and from the Mississippi River in the east to the base of the Rocky Mountains in the west. It's a vast, open, wind-scoured landscape, beautiful in its scale and merciless in its extremes. Summer temperatures regularly hit the 90s and push past 100. Winter blizzards drop visibility to 0 and temperatures to 40 below. There are droughts that last years and floods that arrive in hours. For the nations that called this landscape home, the Lakota, the Cree, the Blackfoot, the Assiniboine, the Crow, the Cheyenne, and dozens of others, survival was not a passive condition. It required foresight that stretched months ahead, planning that accounted for failure at every step, and food systems sophisticated enough to carry a community through the harshest seasons without any external supply. The bison was the center of plains life. A single mature bull could weigh close to 2,000 pounds, and a cow somewhat less. Either animal provided meat, fat, hide for clothing and shelter, bone for tools, sinew for bowstrings and thread, and dung for fuel. The bison wasn't just food, it was infrastructure. Hunters drove herds over cliffs at places the Blackfoot called pishkun, what we now call buffalo jumps, or ran them into corrals and river bends, coordinating hunts that could yield hundreds of animals in a single event. But the bison moved. Herds that numbered in the tens of millions ranged across the plains in seasonal patterns that were predictable in their broad outlines, but unpredictable in their specifics. A nation might follow a herd for weeks and suddenly lose it. A successful hunt might yield more meat than a community could eat in days, far more than they could carry fresh. Fresh meat in warm weather begins to spoil within hours, and within 2 or 3 days it becomes dangerous. Smoke drying could extend that window, but dried meat alone was still bulky and fragile. It wasn't the kind of food you could stake a long winter journey on, not in the quantities needed, not without a carrying system that could move with people across a landscape that offered no resupply points. What was needed wasn't just preserved food, it was concentrated food. Something with the caloric density to fuel hard physical labor day after day, stable enough to survive months without refrigeration, and compact enough to be carried by people on foot, by dogs pulling a travois, the pole and hide sled that served as the primary freight system of the plains, and later by horses. That's what pemmican was engineered to be, and the process behind it was more precise than it looks. Before we dive in, please consider liking and subscribing for more videos like this one. Thanks. At its core, pemmican has 3 components: dried meat, rendered fat, and in many regional variations, dried berries. But the proportions, the preparation methods, and the sequence of steps, that's where the knowledge lived. Get them wrong, And you didn't get pemmican. You got something that would still spoil. The meat came first. Bison was the most common source on the plains, though caribou was standard among the Cree in the north, and elk or moose appeared in regional variations elsewhere. The meat was sliced as thin as possible and then dried completely, either on racks in the sun or hung close to a low, smoky fire. The goal wasn't jerky, which retains flexibility and some internal moisture. The goal was meat dried to brittleness, meat that snapped, meat that had surrendered every trace of water it contained. Once fully dried, the meat was pounded. Women held this knowledge, owned this process, and performed this labor. They used smooth stones to beat the dried meat until it broke down into a coarse, fibrous powder. The grinding mattered more than it might seem, because finer particles meant more surface area, and more surface area meant the fat that came next would coat and bind every fragment more completely. The fineness of the grind was directly related to the shelf life and density of the finished product. The fat came next, and the choice of fat wasn't arbitrary. Bison kidney fat, suet harvested from the thick deposits along the animal's spine and around its internal organs, was the preferred source, and for good reason. It has a higher melting point than fat from muscle tissue. It's harder at room temperature, and it produces a cleaner tallow when rendered. When it hardened around dried meat, it created a tighter, more impermeable seal than any other fat available on the plains. Rendering was its own process. The raw fat was heated slowly, not boiled, which would introduce moisture, but melted gently until it became fully liquid and the impurities could be skimmed away. What remained was clarified tallow. Pure, clean, with almost no water content at all. The powdered meat was then mixed into the hot rendered fat in roughly equal parts by weight, stirred until every particle was completely coated, and pressed into bags made from bison hide called parfleches, or shaped directly into cakes and left to cool and harden. Dried berries went in at this stage if the maker was using them. Saskatoon berries were most common on the northern plains, chokecherries farther south, cranberries in northern woodland regions. They were dried first, sometimes pounded, and added in a smaller proportion, perhaps 1 part berries to 4 or 5 parts meat and fat. As the tallow solidified, it locked around every fragment of dried meat, creating a matrix with almost no air pockets and no exposed moisture. That seal was the mechanism. Fat is hydrophobic, it repels water, and it creates a barrier that oxygen can't easily penetrate. Bacteria need both moisture and oxygen to reproduce, and by eliminating both from the interior of the finished product, the makers of pemmican had created an environment that gave spoilage organisms almost nothing to work with. The result was a food that could sit in a parfleche for a year, endure summer heat and winter freeze, travel hundreds of miles across rough country, and still be safe to eat when you opened it. Pemmican is, calorie for calorie, one of the most energy-dense foods ever produced by any culture on Earth. A single pound of finished pemmican contains somewhere between 3,000 and 3,500 calories. A pound of bread contains roughly 1,200. A pound of cooked rice, around 500. The people carrying pemmican on a winter journey or a war party weren't carrying luxury. They were carrying the most concentrated fuel available in the smallest possible package. The fat-to-protein ratio mattered physiologically, not just calorically. In cold environments, the body burns dietary fat for heat and sustained energy far more efficiently than it burns carbohydrates. Fat provides slow, steady fuel that doesn't spike blood sugar and crash. A person traveling hard in sub-zero temperatures, covering 20 or 30 miles a day on foot, needed exactly that kind of sustained energy, not the quick glucose hit of grain-based food that burns out within hours. There's also what pemmican prevented, which was scurvy. Vitamin C deficiency killed European sailors and soldiers by the thousands during the same centuries that plains nations were thriving on pemmican-heavy diets. The berry-fortified versions provided enough micronutrients to prevent deficiency diseases over extended periods, and accounts from the North American fur trade describe European and Métis voyageurs living almost entirely on pemmican for months during long winter supply runs, covering enormous distances without the illnesses that afflicted their counterparts eating European rations. The Hudson's Bay Company recognized this early. By the early 19th century, pemmican had become so essential to the company's interior operations that it was a commercial commodity, traded and contracted in bulk to fuel the entire network of voyageurs and traders moving goods across the continent. The Pemmican War of 1814, a conflict between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company over control of pemmican supplies in the Red River region, was fought not over gold or land in the conventional sense, but over food. Over this food specifically. That's the measure of what indigenous nations had built. What's easy to miss in a food that seems simple on the surface is how much layered, distributed knowledge its production actually required. You had to know which animals produced the right fat and which parts of those animals yielded the cleanest tallow. You had to know how to render it slowly enough to clarify it without introducing moisture. You had to know how thin to slice the meat for your specific climate, thinner in humid conditions, where thick slices might not dry fully in time. You had to know which berries to use, how to dry them without destroying their nutritional value, and in what proportion to incorporate them. You had to know how to make and seal the Parfleche bags made from rawhide scraped, stretched, and folded in specific ways to be watertight and durable across hundreds of miles of rough travel. And none of this happened in isolation. After a major hunt, dozens of women would work simultaneously, slicing, drying, pounding, rendering, mixing, coordinating their labor to process hundreds of pounds of meat and fat before it could spoil. That knowledge was transmitted through direct instruction and apprenticeship. Older women taught younger women. Mothers taught daughters. The specific ratios, the feel of properly pounded meat, the look of tallow that had rendered correctly, these were learned through doing over years until they became instinct. Nations across thousands of miles of territory, from the Canadian subarctic to the southern plains, arrived at broadly similar methods through independent development, which says everything about how thoroughly the underlying problem had been solved. Pemmican was a solved problem, not a primitive food, not a curiosity, a precision-engineered solution to one of the most fundamental challenges of human existence. How do you sustain life and physical performance across a vast, hostile landscape through an unpredictable season without access to any external supply? The nations of the Great Plains answered that question centuries before anyone else was asking it in those terms. They answered it with fat ratios and drying times and rendered tallow and ground-dried meat and berry supplements and watertight hide containers, working entirely within the materials their environment provided and refining the answer across generations. Today, that tradition continues. Indigenous communities, survival food researchers, and backcountry athletes are reviving pemmican as a high-performance food, reconnecting with a technology that was never actually primitive, just waiting to be rediscovered. The refrigerator came later, the tin can came later, the vacuum-sealed pouch, the freeze-dried meal, the energy bar, all of it came later. Pemmican was first, and it worked. If you liked this video, please hit like and subscribe for more videos like this one in the future. Thanks a lot.